Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. A redacted version of the Mueller report into Trump's Russia connections has been making waves. While exonerating Trump of collusion with Russia, Mueller lays out the president's attempts to obstruct justice. Yet, he refrained from specifically accusing Trump of obstruction, saying a federal criminal investigation would hurt the commander-in-chief's ability to govern. At least one high-ranking Democrat has called for impeachment proceedings to begin. A subpoena has also been issued for the entire report to be released without redaction. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. via Skype. And we're also joined by Dr. Frank Moles, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. He's joining us now from Queensland via Skype as well. Frank and Michael, thank you both for joining us. Michael, I'll start with you. What have you made of the Mueller report so far and its reactions?
Well, I think what we found out is that anybody who wants to find anything they want to find in the Mueller report, they can do it. Supporters of the president point to it and correctly note that there has been absolutely no suggestion of criminal activity, that the collusion thing, which started the whole thing, was just non-existent from the beginning. And then we go into the process of the whole thing and whether or not the president had committed any crimes. On the one hand, the president's supporters can read it as a document which exonerates the president because even though there are many embarrassing and even bad things in there, nonetheless, at the staff level, anytime the president suggested that they do something that would have approached being an obstruction crime, his staff declined to carry that out. If I was an opponent of the president, I would look at it and say, well, it doesn't matter that they didn't do anything. The fact that they were talking about doing anything, the fact that the president issued orders to do things, the fact that the president clearly is not understanding of what the limits on the power of the presidency are, is all we need to pursue this further and move it in the direction of possible impeachment.
Indeed, Frank, I wonder, what you make. Do you think that Donald Trump would intentionally want to obstruct justice?
My sense is that it was not so much intentional as opposed to not quite knowing how far he could take things. As Mike already said, the fact that there's rumors or even now evidence potentially that he gave instructions that were not followed through by his staff are a bit of a sign of that, I think. So in a sense, his staff have protected him from many problems, potentially. The other thing to remember as well is, of course, that for a judge, for a investigative team to come to a conclusion, to have the proverbial smoking gun, there'd have to be clear evidence of intent. And that intent would have to be unambiguous in the form of an email instructing the staff to do something that's illegal or to collude.
And I'm glad you brought up that point of intent, Frank, if I may cut in. I wanted to ask you, for the president, obviously there would be intent, wouldn't there, or motivation at the very least, to want this probe not to go the way it seemed to be going for a very long time.
Yeah, so there's on the one hand this problem of what is there perhaps redacted that would suggest that he actually explicitly instructed to do his staff to do things that could be seen as unambiguous evidence of the intention to collude. That would be highly problematic, and of course his opponents would be very keen to see that kind of evidence. And on the other hand, we see his opponents, of course, keen to make more of it than necessary, if you like.
Michael, I wonder what you make of that. Trump certainly had motivation, didn't he, throughout these 2 odd years of investigation to want to impede this probe as much as possible?
Well, I don't know if it was impede as much as he wanted it just to go away. He assumed, perhaps correctly, and this was even stated in the report, it was information that he got that one of his people said that if you have a special prosecutor established during a presidency, that essentially becomes the end of the effectiveness of the presidency. That from that point on, they're fighting the special prosecutor, and your ability to function as chief executive of the United States and to get your programs through Congress become that much more difficult. And I think the last 2 years has certainly borne that out. So Trump really wanted it to go away. I don't know that there was anything that he was trying to hide, because the report concluded that there was no collusion with the Russians, that although the Russians had a broad, expansive program trying to influence the United States elections, there was no cooperation or collusion with not only nobody with the Trump campaign, but no American at all cooperated and concluded. So the president was obviously concerned a great deal about the effectiveness of his presidency. I think the last 2 years have borne that out. But there's not really any motivation why the president would have obstructed the probe, because he knew that there was no collusion in the first place.
Okay, so Frank, people, and I was reading an interesting article today on CNN, and it sort of flips the coin and the narrative on this in that specific piece. I forget the writer's name right now, but he essentially pointed out that we should actually be looking at Obama's administration and their actions, because they're the ones, obviously, essentially at first, the Democrats coming out with this collusion, accusation against Donald Trump. It would have been under Obama's watch, though, that any alleged collusion would have taken place. Do you think that people should be looking closer at why possibly the Obama administration would have A, accused the president-elect of collusion, and B, why they didn't do anything about it if they so felt?
I think the point here is that there is indeed much more to be looked at. But even the story as we have in front of us already has a lot more to look at it. Think of the Julian Assange arrest a couple of days ago, how that links up with Chelsea Manning's rearrest in the United States. That too is something that is not out of the picture here. The sense is that there might be other evidence coming forward. That could it be that Julian Assange has other evidence that he could suddenly release, including about the Obama administration? That also leads me to talk about the article that appeared a couple of days ago about the Mueller report, also now finding that Assange might have not spoken the truth when he said it was Seth Rich who leaked the DNC emails. That could have come from Russia. So that too is an interesting development, where suddenly is Julian Assange a villain or a hero? I think in many people's vision, that's already a big question mark. And the latest report that we now have in front of us casts further doubt on that, including on, indeed, the role of the DNC campaign, the Obama campaign, the Clinton campaign, and so forth. So it's not as clear-cut that there's one side of politics here that is clearly under investigation. There's more questions to be asked, including about the previous administration.
That's a very good point that you brought up there, Frank. Michael, I wonder what you make of that, because I imagine there should be questions asked of the Obama administration's actions at that time, right? I mean, the CNN article that I quoted to Frank essentially also then questions, listen, if the Obama administration felt so strongly about possible collusion, why they didn't do anything? Were they trying to cover up their own failures vis-a-vis Russia because they wanted Russia to remain happy with them so that the Iran nuclear deal could remain in place, et cetera, et cetera? What do you make of that, Michael?
Well, these are excellent and ongoing questions, and I believe that they will be investigated. Whether or not we get to a reasonable end to that investigation and find out exactly what happened, we don't know. But the Department of Justice Inspector General is currently in the middle of a probe looking into the origins of this whole investigation. How did it start? What was the evidence upon which it was built? Et cetera. And that report from the Inspector General is expected out sometime in May. I would guess probably about another 5 weeks from now or something like that. Once we get that, it may or may not answer enough questions that will give the Attorney General then, Mr. Barr, the chance to launch his own Department of Justice investigation into the origins of the entire investigation. If there was any criminal activity, any collusion on the part of the Obama administration, what steps the Obama administration officials took that were legal, or what steps they took that were outside the legal system, whether or not there was a conspiracy among them to influence the election on behalf of Secretary Clinton. All these are questions that people in the United States have been asking more and more for the last 2 years. And I think now that the Mueller report is concluded and the Inspector General is going to issue his report within the next 4 or 5 weeks, that these questions will increase in intensity, and Barr will really have no choice but to follow up on his promise to launch an investigation as to how the whole thing got started, what was behind it, what were the motivations, was it legal?
Okay, so Frank, interesting things that come out, obviously, and the many reactions that we're seeing ever since this redacted report has come out, is that, Elizabeth Warren, for example, the senator, has called for impeachment proceedings to begin, saying it's, in fact, a duty, a constitutional duty, is, I believe, the words that she used, for that to occur. Kamala Harris, I believe, has also said that she would likely support at least proceedings to begin, an investigation in that regard to begin. Do you think that's where this is heading, Frank?
I personally don't think so. I think that the process for that is incredibly protracted. The bar will be incredibly high. So there's two problems here: the length of the process and the height of the bar. So I think what we might see is that this is used politically rather than in the procedural sense. For starters, not everyone in the Democratic Party has agreed that this is the path to take. So I think what we might end up is with Trump's opponents, particularly the Warrens and the Kamala Harris, is to make it the story as long as possible, to keep this on voters' radar, to make sure that this doesn't go away. So I think we're here in the sort of land of a political play, where the talk of impeachment is there, and there would be certainly people who would press for it if the opportunity arose. But I think the plan B is to just keep the political attention on it, to make sure that this is not going away anytime soon. The elections of 2020 are still a year and a half away, give or take. But if you can extend this story for another 6 months, it's going to wear him down, as it were. And I think that's probably the party political story here.
Okay, we're going to go to a very short break now, and Frank, and we're going to ask our viewers to stay with us too. Please do stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation. We're going to come back with that issue of impeachment. I'm going to ask Michael about that. Stay with us for that. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope as we continue to discuss the Mueller report and its ramifications, of course, the redacted report at this time. Michael, I wanted to begin with you, and I wanted to ask you again about the impeachment issue. Do you think that that is something that will now come up more? I mean, I know that early on in this Mueller investigation, a few people had mentioned that, but no very high-level Democrats had. And now that Warren and Harris and I believe a few others have supported that idea, at least for proceedings to begin, do you think that will pick up steam?
Well, I think it'll certainly pick up press coverage, and more people will do it. But you have to look at it in the context of where United States domestic policy is at this point. We're in the beginnings of the campaign for 2020 to select a president, and whether or not President Trump will be elected or whether one of his adversaries will be elected. Elizabeth Warren is a senator who a lot of people had great hopes for. She's been in the race for about 2.5 months now, 3 months. Her campaign has fallen completely flat. Her fundraising is non-existent. Her press coverage is non-existent. She's struggling, looking for a way to put herself back into the debate. And in the Democratic Party race for their nomination, the harder, the more unreasonable you can be on President Trump, the more likely you are to garner support. So I think you need to look at what she says, and as the rest of them come on and jump on her train, they will be doing the same thing. It's all part
of Michael, I wanted to cut in fact, on that point you just made, a very pertinent point. Do you think a lot of the Democrats have just become obsessed almost with an anti-Trump narrative? Because if I'm completely honest with you, watching from the outside in, if I'm watching a channel like CNN versus Fox, CNN does seem quite obsessed with an anti-Trump narrative, while Fox would obviously want to be defending Trump at least 90% of the time. That does seem like it's just divisive politics just for the sake of that, isn't it?
In many respects, I agree with you 100%. Yes, there is a lot of divisive politics going on. The strategy that the president's adversaries chose 2 years ago at the beginning of his presidency was to oppose, resist, and to attack on every possible occasion. They've successfully done that, and they've hampered President Trump's presidency quite successfully by doing that. I expect them to continue that strategy, and part of that strategy will be to call for impeachment. But even though all the presidential candidates will eventually get there, and I think sooner rather than later, you've got some people who understand that would be an actual overstep and overreach if they indeed did it, because there really is nothing in the Mueller report that justifies the call or the moving towards impeachment. So we will continue to see Judiciary Chairman Nadler and Intelligence Chairman Schiff and some other people such as that continue to issue subpoenas, continue to have investigations, continue to have committee hearings, doing their best to keep this issue in the press. But at the end of the day, I think that Speaker Nancy Pelosi is smart enough and intelligent enough to know that she needs to squash any real attempts at impeachment, because that will be seen as a bridge too far and will come back as a backlash against the Democrats should they do it.
Frank, I wonder what you make of this just Trump hysteria. Sometimes it seems like on the side of the Democrats and the more left-leaning parts of the U.S. population. Do you think it has in some ways gone too far?
It has in some ways gone too far. And I think even thinking in terms of effectiveness, what does really work in terms of the campaign strategy? We're now in a political climate where you have two tribes that are drifting further and further away, where the big issue is then that evidence really doesn't count for much anymore. No amount of evidence of some kind of wrongdoing would persuade a Trump voter to suddenly no longer vote for Trump. And no amount of evidence in the Mueller report, say, for example, that it wasn't all that bad, would convince an ardent anti-Trump person to come around and say, oh, well, maybe I was a bit. So we've gone into this kind of hyperbolic circus, if you like, with two tribes that don't look at evidence anymore. They are just completely subject to confirmation bias on both ends, of course. So that is also interesting to see that we can talk about the Mueller report, and I'm sure that, as Michael has said, there'll be a lot of attention. What's been redacted out? Can we get more? And there will be one subpoena after the other. The circus will continue. But of course, the political psychology story is that it won't shift any the ground in terms of voter support. It will only spiral away from each other. Or perhaps an alternative scenario is if the Democrats were to push too hard on impeachment and subpoenas, what could happen is that Trump could well benefit from some kind of martyrdom, from some kind of victimhood, right? Being the underdog and constantly being under siege. So in a weird way, this could indeed backfire for the Democrats and actually help the Republicans, even though that's quite unexpected for some people.
Indeed. Michael, it's interesting because Congress's approval ratings have not ever been really good, especially in recent years. Do you think that this entire episode of partisanship at this level is hurting in many ways a lot of these politicians and just Americans' point of view on them?
Yes, but you have to remember it's a long-term, age-old observation that Americans love to hate Congress. Congress has always been held in low esteem, but even though they hate Congress, they love their own congressmen. Our re-election rates are ridiculously high in the United States, and that has something to do with redistricting, where members of Congress choose their own constituents rather than vice versa. But there won't be any wholesale changes here except for the 30 or 40 people, Democrats mostly at this point, who represent swing districts. There may be people like Chairman Nadler and Chairman Schiff who represent very, very safe districts, and people like Alexandria Cortez, who represents a safe district, also Ilnar Oman. But there are 30 or 40 Democrats who represent very, very swing districts. They campaigned on the idea of cooperating with the president, finding common ground, and moving forward. Yeah. And if the Democrats in the House moved forward with impeachment, it would be very problematic for those 30 or 40 Democrats who represent swing districts to go along with the whole thing. They're interested in self-preservation. They want to get reelected, and being out front on the impeachment process is not their path to reelection.
Frank, I wonder what you make of that, because, do you think, as Michael there correctly pointed out, obviously the individual states which would vote in a specific congressman or congresswoman would support that specific person. But then I imagine as a whole, is it legitimate, do you think, Frank, to look down upon Congress and its overall performance, especially when it comes to this issue? Again, partisanship 101.
Yeah, I think there's two levels to this story. I think at one level we have the sort of districts where you've got your swing districts and how that would pan out in districts, and that's a very interesting analysis that Michael just gave, which I probably would agree with. But at the same time, we also have a broader narrative. For decades, if not a century, we know that elections are not necessarily won on the basis of local issues, that it's often more the narrative, right? The famous expression is, if you control the narrative in a country, then elections are secondary. Then there's a groundswell of support for somebody new. Yeah. The whole Trump election was a textbook example of a narrative that grips the country, that it actually already decides how the ball is going to run, including in swing states, or particularly in swing states. So I'm a bit torn in two directions here, sort of a micro-analysis of the electorate level, the district level, what would happen, how would that cause problems or opportunity for individual candidates of a particular party political color. But I think the bigger story is the one that says what is happening in the minds of the average American. Are we seeing a Trump who is delivering on the economy? Is that going to suffice? Is that going to be something where a lot of Americans might say, well, listen, he may have been involved in some things that could be considered dodgy, but hey, he's delivering, the economy is going well, we've seen job growth and so forth. Yeah. If that's the narrative that carries him over, then that probably be a far more influential factor in the next elections. Or the flip side, is there enough of dirt going around? Is there enough mud sticking to him where people say, well, the economy is not in too bad a shape, but how much is that Trump's credit? Did we not end up with an administration that's un-American worthy, right? Do we not deserve better as a nation? Some government that everyone can hold in big esteem, high esteem, including people overseas.
Indeed. We'll leave there as our final woman, but we, of course, appreciate both of your time, your insight and analysis this weekend. That was Dr. Frank Moles, Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Queensland. He was speaking to us from Queensland itself. And we were also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He was speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Now, viewers, as Michael and Frank, they're both mentioned, this is essentially a battle of narratives at this time. It's a very partisan battle at this point leading up to those 2020 elections. Trump has been vindicated, if we're completely honest, about this Russia collusion. There must be questions then about why the Democrats, why the Obama administration, why all these people brought up this issue if they didn't have the evidence or they themselves didn't really do anything to stop any alleged collusion. That's an issue which, as Michael said, will possibly be investigated or spoken about in the coming days as well in lead up to those elections. Some Democrats, a few Democrats, I should say, such as Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, speaking about impeachment. Will that occur? How bad will that go for the Democrats? We'll have to wait and see. But certainly both sides of the aisle right now not looking very good. A very partisan fight at this point. And what effect does this have on Trump's presidency or possible win or loss in the next elections? We'll wait and see and keep a close eye on here in Scope. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope. Well, the European Parliament has voted to finalize funding for the European Defence Fund. The concept was agreed upon after consultations with the arms industry, who recommended more military spending, especially on artificial intelligence and drones. Peace activists, though, are questioning the need for more arms, pleading instead for more money to be spent on resolving the root causes of global conflicts, many of which, they would argue, Europe itself instigated. Furthermore, is this another indication of a growing split between Europe and the United States as the two sides find themselves at odds on various global issues? To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Dr. Olamide Samuel, who is a teaching fellow at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, that is part of the University of London. He's joining us now via Skype from London itself. And we're also joined by Dr. Justin Gibbins, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in Dubai. He is joining us now on the line from Dubai in the UAE. Justin and Ola, thank you both for joining us. Ola, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the European Defence Fund? Is it necessary?
The European Defence Fund has been in the making for quite some time now. And the rationale behind the EDF, as put out by President Juncker, has been to strengthen the European citizens' security. Now, looking at the details of the European Defence Fund, it doesn't seem to fit a collective security arrangement or a common security position for Europe. It looks more like a business industry-led initiative that essentially aids the ease of pouring funds into the defense industry. So I don't really buy the rhetoric that this EDF will make Europe any safer as opposed to other initiatives possible.
Do you agree with that, Justin? Because, certainly it's odd, isn't it, that the arms industry would have been the ones brought in to discuss this situation, and then their essentially, their point of view was the one that seems to have won the day.
Certainly. I mean, I completely agree, really. I think perhaps initially, manufacturers and institutions and industries associated with defense were brought in, initially as somewhat as an advisory role. But at the end of the day, I think some of the curious things about this is really the speed at which this policy, the European Defence Fund, has been appropriated and has been kind of pushed through, if you like. Like the broader question about whether it securitizes Europe is kind of up for debate, but even in terms of the funding, it can't compete with NATO on any kind of tangible level. So you certainly do feel, and there was an article printed fairly recently in The Guardian about this, that really it's there to kind of defend kind of economic liberal arguments in relation to the defense industry, European defense industries, and it's less really about securitizing Europe and making kind of European citizens feel safer. So certainly, I think that's a notable aspect of it, really.
So then, Ola, I wonder, with more arms, be it artificial intelligence, be it drones, then the issue always becomes then, where are you going to use those arms? Does this then mean going forward that Europe will be ever more aggressive overseas?
With regards to the use of these arms, certainly it's almost common knowledge that the proliferation of arms tends to ensure that conflict occurs in places where structural conditions are ripe. Looking at Europe in the global arms trade, the EU as a collective is the second largest exporter of arms in the world, with 27% of global market share, trailing the United States by about 6%, where they hold 34% of the market share. And looking at the details of the EDF, about 2/3 of European-made arms are exported outside the EU. A third of those going into the Middle East, etc., into places where conflict is most likely. So I don't think we would expect to see the European Union become more aggressive in its posturing and its entanglement in geostrategic conflicts, but we do expect to see increased use of European-made arms and military technology in these scenarios.
What do we make of that, Justin? Because, the argument I imagine made by many countries who would buy such arms possibly, that, listen, we need to have good defenses, in a world which has that many more threats growing possibly on a daily basis from terrorism or otherwise. Every country needs its defenses up. So what's really done wrong with having Europe working through this defense fund?
Well, in theory, there's nothing there's certainly nothing wrong in kind of like centralizing aspects that have, a global impact, and of course, issues relating to security, international terrorism, and so forth are very much top of the list. And as your guest rightfully mentioned, the EU Commissioner Juncker back in 2016 in his State of the Union address really was talking about the European Defence Fund as a means of kind of protecting kind of European citizens. So in terms of the actual desire, if you like, to kind of securitize Europe and to kind of make citizens feel more secure, there's nothing really wrong with it. But in terms of international relations, one of the classic aspects is, of course, the security dilemma, and that relates to the fact that institutions, states that wish to kind of securitize themselves, that wish to kind of make themselves safer, of course, they build up militaries, which has the kind of dilemma, the paradox of making them less safe, because of course it enables rivals to kind of do the same. So I'm not really bowled over by this aspect of kind of centralizing approaches to militarization, because of course most perceived threats these days really tend to be more from kind of non-state actors, which render such centralization not always the correct way of dealing with it. So in theory, the desire to kind of like approach things in such a manner as prioritizing security are right, but whether or not it's practically the right way to do things is, I think, a different kettle of fish, really.
Sure. Okay. So Ola, let's first talk politics, if we may, because Europe and the United States, at least seemingly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they seem to be split on a number of issues, global issues, don't they? And many would, I imagine, look at this sort of European defense fund and say, is this a further sign of any such split? And I can, name a number of issues. For example, the Iran nuclear deal. Europe wants to stand by it. Obviously, the U.S. has walked away from it, and there are possibly other areas where they would disagree, such as Germany still wanting Russian energy, et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of that? Do you think this is a sign of a further split between the EU and the US?
On the contrary, I would argue that this doesn't necessarily represent a split between the European Union and the US-led NATO. Many have described the EDF as a path to common defense policy that essentially replaces or duplicates NATO effort. But at this time, most of the rhetoric coming out of the European Union has been firm in saying that this assumption is premature, and that the exclusion of NATO, or the sideline of NATO, has been explicitly excluded for the time being. Now, in terms of the capabilities of the EU to actually pull away from NATO, we have to think of the fact that there is no clear vision about what EU defense would look like at the time being. And this is because geostrategic considerations at the nation-state level in the European Union still determines threat perception across the continent. So there was a recent publication by the European Council of Foreign Relations that actually looked at threat perception. And what this study actually highlighted was that threat perception from the east of Europe to the west of Europe varies remarkably. And so this undermines the creation of a clear vision of EU defense policy. There's also many EU countries, especially in Eastern Europe and the Nordic countries, that still trust NATO and the United States much more in terms of securing, or in terms of creating a security alliance, and actually oppose anything that resembles a duplication of NATO efforts. So to come to my main point, if anything, the EU would actually, the EDF funding would actually reinforce military capabilities of European allies, or the European pillar within NATO. So I think it's a complementary approach. Yes, there are divisions that exist, but I think what would eventually happen is a strengthening of the European pillar within NATO in terms of capabilities.
Justin, I want to get your point of view on that, because it's interesting. I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong again, but I imagine that Donald Trump would look at all of this funding for the European Defense Fund and wonder, listen, I have been asking the Europeans to put more towards NATO, and now they're making this setting up this EDF. Why aren't they just putting more money into NATO itself?
It's true. It's true. Well, look, I mean, back in 2014, there were only 3 of the 29 member NATO states that were meeting their 2% GDP obligations for funding NATO. Now, I mean, there are 7. I mean, there's US, Greece, UK, the Baltic states, and Poland as well. But I certainly agree with your guest. I don't actually think that the EDF functions as a kind of competitor for NATO. It is a complement to NATO. Look, the US has made it fairly clear the EU must do more to defend its own borders and to get rid of the moral hazard that basically it's been riding on of not really ensuring, not really willing to kind of pay its way, because of course it had the US to defend its interests. I mean, the US now still pays slightly less than 70% of the total NATO budget. So actually, I think there isn't any. I don't envisage there being a kind of fragmented response or a kind of antagonistic response from the U.S. administration about the desire for the EDF to be set up. I mean, it's a drop in the ocean when you think about it in terms of the funding, which, according to the European Parliament, what they've recently agreed upon, will extend funding of the EDF 13 billion euros over the next seven years, which is nothing in comparison with kind of the contributions made by NATO countries. I think where there might be a problem is from an intra-European level, where there might be disagreements on this issue within between European state members, particularly in the light of whether or not such security measures apply to countries that are outside of the European Union, which might affect Britain, of course, with the current Brexit debacle. So I don't see a conflict between the United States and European states over the EDF, but I do see a potential conflict on security issues, which have always been a kind of nation-state level kind of policy area. Might see some level of fragmentation and disagreement between EU members.
Ola, I wonder what you make of that, because on that point that Justin there just made about the UK and Brexit, from what I've understood is that Prime Minister May has actually said the UK will continue to contribute to this fund. So while the UK may be seeking to walk away from the Union, it still wants very much to be part of this military fund. What do you make of that?
You're absolutely right. The United Kingdom has been very clear in the fact that regardless of the outcome of Brexit in terms of the political arrangement between the UK and the EU, they will do whatever they can to preserve the security arrangement between the UK and the EU. And there's quite a number of security arrangements that the UK actively benefits from. The PNR registration system, the passenger name registration system, the PRUNE system, and many other intelligence gathering capabilities. So the UK actively seeks to preserve that relationship. And we saw a few months ago that quite a few former heads of defense, MI5 and MI6, came out to actively speak against a no-deal Brexit in order to preserve that common security architecture. And actually, Brexit has eventually become an opportunity for the EU to be able to take some initiative in creating this defense fund and possibly in the future the European Army, which is a separate and equally controversial issue. But the UK has been one of those states, like the Nordic states I mentioned earlier, that have actively blocked any sort of defense cooperation in the EU that might undermine or duplicate NATO efforts. So with the exit of the United Kingdom from the EU, we see that, at least in the short and medium term, there's the opportunity for the remaining 27 member states to create or enhance EU defense cooperation. There's also an interesting nexus to this Brexit angle, and that's the EU elections in May. So we were very aware of the accelerated pace of the EDF development and adoption within the European Parliament, and quite a lot of due process was ignored, especially the thematic working groups that usually debate these issues before the senior ambassadors in the EU. And the reason they rushed this decision, essentially, the reason they pushed forward for the adoption of the EDF is because from the UK perspective, there are parties, right-wing parties, that have actively promised to disrupt progress in the European Parliament from the next session, which begins in autumn. We've heard of the Brexit Party, which is an unprecedented move and is scarily popular. And Nigel Farage has promised to cause as much disruption in this regard. So I think there was a strategic calculation there, pushing for the EDF to be adopted as soon as possible before this session is over.
Indeed. Justin, I wanted to bring a point that, again, I read in a Guardian article, I believe it was written by Andrew Smith of the Campaign Against Arms Trade. And Andrew brought up that point, Justin, that, why would Europe not want to spend this money, for example, on solving the root causes of conflict around the world, which would in some ways threaten it as well, instead of just building up more arms?
Well, this is part of the problem, and I think this is why the EDF kind of raises a lot of questions about the nature of the European Union, which of course everyone has to accept is an evolving institution, but nonetheless, its forerunner, the European Coal and Steel Community, sought to create peace and sought to amalgamate the industries of coal and steel, which of course the industries one needs for war, into a supranational authority. And what we see kind of 70 years later, instead of the soft power, the peace-building aspect of the European Union, which has been developing for kind of 70 years, we see this shift, this kind of paradigm shift into becoming possibly, a more kind of dominant military force. So I think the reason why the EDF really is so important is because it's a potential indication of the changing nature and the changing identity of Europe, or at least possibly, the European Union states, that it's moving away from the soft power focus of economic cooperation and economic interdependence, which is what it's always been built upon, to, the latest kind of outcome of what it's become, which is moving from an economic to a political, and now potentially to a kind of military union. So I think that's I think that's an aspect of the EDF that's quite important. It's kind of an indication of the changing nature of the European Union from becoming a soft power actor to a hard power actor.
All right. Okay, we'll leave there as our final word, gentlemen, but of course we appreciate both of your insight and analysis this weekend. That was Dr. Justin Gibbins, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the College of Humanities and Social Science at Zayed University, speaking to us from Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. We were also joined by Dr. Olamide Samuel, who is a teaching fellow at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS, that is a part of the University of London, and he was speaking to us from the British capital. Now, viewers, as both of our guests there pointed out, there are questions about if the EDF, i.e. the European Defence Fund, is even needed, but what this means for Europe to secure its borders, and of course some of the issues that we weren't able to get to, and that is, of course, why is this money being spent now? Olamide did make the very good point about the European elections, upcoming elections, so this was sort of almost a rushed process in many ways to try to get this done before those elections come about, because a lot of right-wing parties, seemingly at least from the outside, will possibly win those elections and may disrupt any such process if it had not already been decided upon. We'll keep a close eye on that. What this means for NATO as well is an important aspect to keep in mind, which we'll no doubt be speaking about later on here in Scope as well. But that's all for this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.